Wealthy man asks a beggar for help and uncovers a secret that makes him rethink his life. But before that, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep sharing amazing stories. William Carter checked his Rolex, the glint of the gold watch catching the dull light, filtering through the cloud-covered sky. The hands of the watch, a symbol of his status, were ticking closer to an appointment that could define his career. He could already see the faces of the board members, waiting in the glass-walled conference room high above Manhattan, expecting him to deliver a flawless pitch for the merger that would secure his position as one of the most powerful men in the city. The sleek black limousine, a moving fortress of luxury, glided smoothly through the congested streets of New York. William, lost in thoughts of numbers and strategies, barely noticed as the towering buildings of Midtown gave way to more modest, aged structures. The chatter of pedestrians, the distant honking of taxis, and the hum of the city formed a familiar background noise. But today, they grated on his nerves. Suddenly, a jolt knocked him out of his reverie. The car lurched to a stop with a loud clunk. William looked up, startled, as the engine sputtered and died. The silence was deafening. "What's happening?" he snapped, his voice edged with irritation. The driver, a seasoned professional who had never let him down before, looked back with a frown. "I'm not sure, sir. It seems we've had a breakdown." He scanned his surroundings with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't the bustling financial district he was used to. This was a neighborhood that seemed forgotten by time. The buildings were old, their facades cracked and peeling. Small shops with faded signs lined the street, their displays sparse and unremarkable. A few people milled about, their clothes worn, their faces weathered by life's hardships. The scent of something fried wafted from a nearby food cart, mixing with the exhaust fumes from the passing buses. William's gaze followed the sound of a distant saxophone playing a melancholic tune, adding a strange sense of nostalgia to the scene. The sky above was a dull gray, matching the mood that began to settle over him. His phone, usually a lifeline to his world of wealth and power, now displayed no service in the corner. A bead of sweat formed on his brow as the weight of the situation began to press down on him. His driver popped the hood, the man's hands moving quickly, but William could tell from his tense expression that the problem wasn't going to be an easy fix. William stood there, feeling more out of place than he had in years. The seconds ticked away, each one pulling him further from his carefully constructed life. He felt a growing impatience mixed with a strange, unfamiliar discomfort. He needed to find a solution, and fast, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't in control. William's eyes darted around the street, the pressure of his situation pressing down on him like a weight. The once faint sound of the city now felt overwhelming. The distant roar of traffic, the occasional shout from a vendor, the hum of life in a place that seemed untouched by the luxury he was accustomed to. The sky, still a muted gray, seemed to mirror his growing frustration and anxiety. He wasn't used to feeling out of control, and this neighborhood, with its chipped paint and worn brick buildings, was the last place he wanted to be stranded. As he scanned the area, his gaze settled on a man sitting on the edge of the sidewalk, just outside a small, dilapidated convenience store. The man's appearance was a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle around him. He was still, almost like a statue, with a distant look in his eyes that seemed to suggest he was lost in thoughts far removed from the world around him. His clothes were layers of mismatched, threadbare fabrics, probably accumulated over years of hardship. A thick, tangled beard obscured much of his face, and a woolen cap, frayed at the edges, sat low on his head. Next to him, a small, worn-out bag rested against the wall, its contents hidden but likely meager. William hesitated, his instincts warring with his desperation. In his world, people like this man were invisible. Figures passed by without a second thought, their struggles unnoticed and unacknowledged. But now, without any other options, William found himself in the unfamiliar position of needing help from someone he would usually ignore. He took a deep breath and approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. The street seemed quieter now, the noise of the city fading as he drew closer to the man. When he finally stood in front of him, William cleared his throat, the sound awkward in the otherwise silent exchange. "Excuse me," William began, his voice betraying the unease he felt. The man didn't move at first, as if he hadn't heard, but then slowly he lifted his head and their eyes met. William was struck by the man's gaze. There was a depth there, a kind of weary wisdom that caught him off guard. It was a look that spoke of years lived in a world William had never known, and it unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite describe. "I'm in a bit of a situation," William continued, trying to maintain his composure. He gestured toward the limousine, now a lifeless hulk on the side of the road. "My car broke down and I have no way to contact anyone. I was wondering if you could help me." Reaching into the folds of his coat, he pulled out an old, battered flip phone. The phone was scratched, the buttons worn from years of use, but it was functional. William felt a strange mix of relief and something else, something he couldn't quite identify, as he reached out to take the phone. As his fingers brushed against the man's, he was struck by the roughness of the other's skin, a tactile reminder of the hardships this man must have endured. "Thank you," William said, his voice softer, the words carrying more weight than he intended. The man nodded again, still silent, his eyes never leaving William's. It was as if he was searching for something beneath the polished exterior, something that William himself wasn't even sure existed. William turned away to dial, the cold plastic of the phone feeling alien in his hand. The world around him felt distant, the noise of the city muted, as he realized that this encounter was not just an inconvenience. It was something more, something that would linger in his mind long after he walked away. William dialed the number of his assistant, his fingers moving mechanically over the worn buttons of the old flip phone. The device felt foreign in his hand, a stark contrast to the sleek modern technology he was used to. As he waited for the call to connect, he glanced back at the man who had given him the phone. The stranger was still watching him, his expression unreadable, yet there was a calmness about him that seemed at odds with his situation. After a few rings, the call failed to connect, the screen flashing, "Call ended." William's frustration deepened as he tried again, only to meet with the same result. He looked back at the man, who had not moved, but now there was a faint smile on his lips, a knowing look in his eyes. "Signal's not great around here," the man said, his voice raspy yet gentle. "You might have better luck closer to the other side of the block. If you're not in too much of a rush, you're welcome to wait in my place until things sort themselves out." But the alternative was standing out here in the cold, with no means of contacting anyone, and the minutes ticking away. He was about to decline when he noticed the look in Thomas's eyes. There was no pity there, no expectation, just a simple offer made with genuine kindness. Thomas stood up, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that belied his worn appearance. "It's not far," he added, as if sensing William's reluctance. "Just a few blocks down. I've got a little place. It's not much, but it's warm, and you can wait there while you figure things out." "All right," William said, surprising himself with the ease of his agreement. "Lead the way." They walked in silence, the city's noise fading into the background as they moved through the narrow streets. The neighborhood was even more run down than William had initially realized, buildings with peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, and a few boarded-up windows. As they walked, William couldn't help but notice the small details that he had been too distracted to see before. A young mother pulling her child along, an elderly man sitting on a stoop, watching the world pass by with tired eyes, a stray cat darting into an alley. These were scenes from a world William had never truly noticed, much less understood. Thomas led him to a small, weathered building with a narrow door tucked between two larger structures. The entrance was modest, almost hidden, and it struck William how easy it would be to overlook this place, just as he had overlooked people like Thomas for most of his life. "Here we are," Thomas said, opening the door with a creak. The interior was dimly lit, but it was warm, with a faint scent of something familiar and comforting, perhaps coffee or old wood. The space was small but tidy, with a few mismatched pieces of furniture and a blanket draped over a worn-out couch. "You can sit if you like," Thomas offered, gesturing to the couch. "I'll get you something warm to drink while you wait." He glanced around, noticing small details. A few books stacked on a makeshift shelf, a radio that looked like it hadn't worked in years, a faded photograph of someone William didn't recognize. There was a strange sense of peace in this place, a quiet dignity that seemed to reflect the man who lived here. As Thomas moved to the small kitchenette, the sound of a kettle being filled with water reached William's ears. He sat there, feeling an odd mix of emotions, gratitude, discomfort, and something else, something that had begun to stir deep within him since he had first met Thomas on the street. The warmth of the small room began to seep into William's bones as he settled on the worn couch, its cushions sagging under his weight, but offering a surprising comfort. The dim light from a single lamp cast soft shadows on the walls, giving the space a cozy, almost intimate atmosphere. Thomas moved around the kitchenette with practiced ease, his movements deliberate but unhurried. The sound of the kettle heating up filled the silence between them, and for a moment, William simply watched, trying to process the strangeness of his situation. "Not what you're used to, I imagine," Thomas said suddenly, his voice breaking through William's thoughts. He turned to face William, a small smile playing on his lips as he leaned against the counter. William shifted slightly, feeling a pang of awkwardness. "It's different," he admitted, unsure of how to describe the contrast between his usual environment and this modest room. "But it's nice." He poured the hot water into 2 mismatched mugs and brought them over, handing one to William. The aroma of the tea was earthy and soothing, a stark contrast to the expensive coffees William usually drank in his office. They sipped in silence for a moment, the quiet between them comfortable but charged with an unspoken curiosity. William felt the need to fill the space with something, anything, that would make this encounter feel less surreal. "Have you been in this neighborhood long?" William asked, his tone casual, as though they were 2 acquaintances making small talk. Thomas took a slow sip before answering. "A few years now," he said, setting his mug down on a small table beside the couch. "It's got its ups and downs, like anywhere, I suppose." Still, he felt a strange pull to know more, to understand this man who had so generously offered him help without expecting anything in return. "What do you do? I mean, how do you spend your time?" William asked, realizing too late how awkward the question might sound. Thomas didn't seem to mind. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I help out where I can. Sometimes I find odd jobs, fix things up for folks around here. But mostly, I just live, take things one day at a time." They continued talking, the conversation flowing more naturally as they exchanged thoughts on the weather, the changing seasons, and the city's relentless pace. As they spoke, William found himself relaxing, the tension in his shoulders easing as the mundane concerns of his daily life began to fade into the background. "What about you?" Thomas asked after a while, his gaze steady on William. "What keeps you busy? Always something to be done, someone to meet, a deal to close." The initial awkwardness had faded, replaced by a growing sense of connection, however tenuous. William realized that this simple conversation, in a place so far removed from his everyday life, was grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. As they continued to talk, the subjects grew deeper without either of them consciously guiding the conversation there. They touched on dreams, not just those of wealth and success, but the kind that were born out of a deeper longing, dreams of peace, fulfillment, and meaning. They spoke of challenges, not just the obstacles of business or survival, but the internal battles that shaped who they were. William found himself opening up in a way he hadn't done in a long time, sharing thoughts he usually kept hidden behind a polished facade. Thomas listened with the patience of someone who had seen much and judged little. There was a comfort in that, a feeling that in this small room, amidst the modest furnishings and the scent of tea, William could be just a man, stripped of titles and expectations. And as the conversation unfolded, William felt something shift within him, a subtle yet profound change that he couldn't yet fully understand. Thomas took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea, his gaze drifting away from William, as if he were looking at something far beyond the walls of the small room. The conversation had grown quieter, more reflective, and William could sense that they were approaching something deeper, something personal. The warmth of the room, once comforting, now seemed to carry a weight of its own, pressing down on the silence between them. After a long pause, Thomas finally spoke, his voice low and tinged with a quiet sadness. "You know, life wasn't always like this," he began, his words measured as if choosing them carefully. "There was a time when things were different." "I used to play the piano," Thomas said, almost as if confessing a secret. "Not just as a hobby, but as my life's work. It was everything to me." He paused, his fingers twitching slightly as if they were still accustomed to moving over ivory keys. Music was my escape, my joy, my way of making sense of the world. Well, it was good, really good. But then, Thomas continued, his voice growing softer, everything changed. I lost it all in a single moment. His eyes grew distant, and William could tell that he was no longer in the room with him, but somewhere in the past, reliving a memory that had shaped his entire existence. There was a car accident, Thomas said, the words heavy with emotion. I was driving home late one night after a performance, tired but happy. My wife, she was waiting for me. We had this little ritual, you know? After every concert, no matter how late, we'd sit up and talk about it. She loved hearing about the audience, the music, everything, but that night, I never made it home. The doctors did what they could, but I never played again. My career was over in an instant, but that wasn't the worst of it. She left not long after. I don't blame her, really. I was a shell of the man I used to be. The music was gone, and with it, the person I once was. The room seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker with the weight of Thomas's story. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was clear that Thomas wasn't looking for pity or sympathy. He was simply sharing a truth, a piece of his past that had shaped the man he had become. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his eyes returning to the present, but the sadness lingered in them. I lost everything that mattered that night, he said quietly. The music, my wife, my life as I knew it. And that's how I ended up here, in this neighborhood. Just surviving. It was a story that William could hardly begin to comprehend, yet it was one that he knew would stay with him long after he left this small, dimly lit room. William sat in stunned silence, the weight of Thomas's story pressing down on him like an anchor. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as he processed the tragic turn of events that had led this man, this once great pianist, to where he was now. The warmth of the tea he held had long since faded, yet he found himself unable to move, his mind spinning with thoughts that he hadn't allowed himself to confront in years. Success. It was a word that had defined William's life, a driving force that propelled him through endless meetings, deals, and negotiations. His entire existence was built around the pursuit of more money, more power, more recognition. He was always on the move, always striving for the next big achievement, never stopping to consider the cost. But now as he sat in this modest room, surrounded by the remnants of a life shattered by tragedy, William felt something shift inside him. Thomas's words echoed in his mind, not just the details of the accident, but the raw emotion behind them, the loss, the helplessness, the devastation of having everything you've built taken away in an instant. William's gaze drifted to his hands, still holding the cooling mug of tea. He thought about how much he relied on them, not just to sign contracts or shake hands with powerful men, but to maintain his image, his control over the world he had crafted for himself. He had always taken his success for granted, viewing it as a natural extension of his abilities and ambition. But Thomas's story forced him to confront a different reality, one where even the most carefully constructed lives could crumble in a heartbeat. He looked around the room again, taking in the small details he had missed before. The mismatched furniture, the old radio, the faded photograph. Each item told a story, a piece of a life that was once full of promise and hope. And now, sitting here in this quiet space, William couldn't help but wonder what his own life would look like if everything he valued were suddenly stripped away. For the first time in years, William began to question the choices he had made. The endless hours at the office, the nights spent away from home, the deals that demanded more and more of his time and energy. What had they really given him? Yes, he had wealth, power, and status. But at what cost? He thought of his family, the relationships he had neglected, the moments he had missed in his pursuit of success. The word success began to lose its luster in his mind, becoming something more hollow, more elusive. What did it mean to be successful, if it meant losing everything else that mattered? Thomas had been at the pinnacle of his career, living a life filled with music and love, only to have it all taken from him in a moment. And yet, here he was, surviving, finding a way to live even without the things that once defined him. William's thoughts drifted to his own future. What would happen if his world were to collapse in the same way? Would he be able to endure, to rebuild? Or would he, like Thomas, find himself lost, unable to recover from the loss of everything he had worked so hard to achieve? As these thoughts swirled in his mind, William felt a deep unease settle in his chest. He had always believed that his success was a testament to his abilities, a reward for his hard work and dedication. But now, he was beginning to see that it was also a fragile construct, one that could be shattered without warning. The room seemed to close in around him as he grappled with these new realizations. The warmth and security of his previous life feeling distant and unattainable. For the first time, William saw the path he was on not as a straight line leading to more success, but as a precarious balance, one that could be upended by forces beyond his control. He looked at Thomas again, seeing not just a man who had lost everything, but someone who had faced the unimaginable and found a way to keep going. There was a strength in that, a resilience that William wasn't sure he possessed. The thought left him feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years. William's reflection was interrupted as Thomas shifted in his seat, the movement pulling him back to the present. The conversation would continue, but William knew that he would never be quite the same after this moment. Something had changed within him, a seed of doubt about the life he had built and the choices he had made. And as he sat there, surrounded by the quiet remnants of a once vibrant life, William couldn't help but wonder if he had been pursuing the wrong kind of success all along. As Thomas continued to speak, his voice calm and steady, William felt a strange sensation growing within him, a tug at the edges of his memory. The details of Thomas's life, the music, the concerts, the deep connection he had once had with the piano, began to stir something in William, something that had been buried in the past. Thomas described the way he used to play, how the piano keys felt beneath his fingers, how the music would flow from his soul and fill the grand concert halls. As he spoke, the image of a younger Thomas, confident and composed on stage, began to take shape in William's mind. The way Thomas described the energy in the room, the silent anticipation of the audience, and the profound stillness that would follow the last note, it all felt eerily familiar to William, as though he had experienced it himself. Then, like a flash of lightning, it hit him. William's breath caught in his throat as a memory from years ago surfaced with startling clarity. He had been in one of those concert halls, sitting among the audience, watching a pianist who had captivated him in a way no other musician ever had. The pianist's performance had been transformative, so full of emotion and technical brilliance that it had left William, a man not easily moved, with a deep, almost spiritual sense of awe. The music had resonated with something inside him, a part of him that he rarely acknowledged, and for weeks after, he had found himself reflecting on that night, on the power of the performance to evoke such profound feelings. As he looked at Thomas now, the recognition clicked into place. This man, sitting here in this modest room, was the same pianist who had played that night, the man who had inspired him, who had touched something deep within him through the universal language of music. The realization was like a jolt to his system, shaking him to his core. William's mind raced as the memories flooded back. He remembered the evening clearly now, the grandeur of the concert hall, the way the audience had been enraptured by the performance, the way Thomas's fingers had danced over the keys with such effortless grace. And he remembered how, after the concert, he had felt a rare sense of peace, a brief escape from the relentless drive of his business-focused life. But to connect that experience with the man before him now, the man who had lost everything and was living a life so far removed from that world of art and beauty, it was almost too much for William to process. He stared at Thomas, trying to reconcile the memories of that brilliant performer with the reality of the present, and found himself at a loss for words. Thomas seemed unaware of the storm of emotions brewing within William. He continued speaking about his past, about the places he had performed, the people he had met, but William's thoughts were now somewhere else, locked onto the realization that the man he had once admired from afar was now sitting right in front of him, sharing tea in a small, worn-out apartment. The connection was undeniable, yet the contrast between the man Thomas had been and the man he was now was almost painful for William to comprehend. It made him question so many things, about fate, about the fragility of success, and about the choices he had made in his own life. As William listened, the realization that he had once witnessed the peak of Thomas's career, that he had been part of an audience that had applauded him with standing ovations, brought a wave of emotions he hadn't expected. It was a moment of profound connection, but also one of deep sadness, as William could not ignore the stark reality of where that path had led Thomas. The room felt charged with the weight of this unspoken connection, and William knew that nothing between them would ever be the same. The man who had once inspired him was now revealing the depths of his fall, and it left William with a sense of responsibility, of needing to do something, though what, he wasn't yet sure. For now, all he could do was sit in stunned silence, grappling with the knowledge that their lives had crossed paths in such an extraordinary, unexpected way. William sat back on the worn couch, his mind racing with the realization of who Thomas truly was. The weight of the moment hung in the air, thick and palpable. He couldn't shake the image of the younger Thomas on stage, commanding the grand piano with such grace and power. That memory, once distant, now felt vivid and immediate, as if it had just happened yesterday. The man who had given William that fleeting moment of peace and beauty so many years ago was now here, sitting across from him, a shadow of the artist he once was. The room seemed to close in around William as the enormity of the situation pressed down on him. He knew he couldn't just leave and pretend this encounter hadn't happened. He owed something to this man, not just because of their shared history, but because of the human connection they had formed in these few short hours. William looked at Thomas, really looked at him, and saw more than just the worn clothes and the lines etched into his face. He saw the remnants of the brilliant pianist, the man who had once lived for music, whose life had been irreversibly changed by tragedy. And for the first time in a long while, William felt an urge to do something purely out of compassion, without any ulterior motive or benefit to himself. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how dry it felt, and leaned forward slightly. "Thomas," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I know this might seem out of the blue, but I've been thinking, you're an incredible musician, one of the best I've ever heard. What if there was a way for you to play again? I don't know the details of your situation," William continued, "but I believe there's always a way. Maybe we could find a way to get you back on stage, to give you a chance to play again. I have connections, resources. I could help make it happen. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think it could be worth exploring." The offer hung in the air between them, a bridge between the past and the future, between the man Thomas had been and the man he could still become. William knew he was asking a lot, but he also knew that he couldn't walk away without at least trying. This was more than just an act of charity. It was a recognition of talent, of a life that had once been full of promise, and the belief that it wasn't too late to reclaim some of that. William's voice softened even further, almost a whisper now. I just want to help if you'll let me." He didn't know what else to say, so he let the words settle, hoping that Thomas could feel the sincerity behind them. As he waited, the silence between them grew thicker, each second stretching longer than the last. William realized that whatever happened next, this moment would stay with him forever. A moment where he reached out, not as a businessman, but as a fellow human being, offering a hand to someone who had once inspired him in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. Thomas listened quietly as William spoke, his expression calm and unreadable. The offer, so unexpected and generous, hung in the air between them. For a long moment, Thomas didn't say anything, letting the weight of William's words settle into the space around them. The silence felt both heavy and light, filled with the possibilities that William was offering, but also with the realities that Thomas had come to accept. Finally, Thomas sighed softly, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of many years. He looked at William, his gaze steady but gentle, and there was a deep understanding in his eyes, the kind that comes from living through profound loss and finding a way to survive it. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, William," Thomas began, his voice warm but firm. "I really do. It's not every day that someone offers you a chance to reclaim something you've lost. But the truth is, I've made peace with the way things are. But when it all went away, I had to find a way to keep going. For a long time I was angry, bitter even. I kept thinking about what I had lost and it nearly destroyed me. But then over time I realized something. I realized that life isn't just about what you achieve or what you own. It's about how you live with what you have, no matter how much or how little that is. I lost my music, yes, but I didn't lose myself. And that was what saved me." It was a perspective that William had never really considered, always too focused on the next big deal, the next achievement, to think about what truly mattered. Thomas continued, his voice calm and steady. "I've found peace in the little things, the morning sun, the sound of birds, the kindness of strangers. These are things that no one can take away from me. They're not as grand as playing in a concert hall, but they're real, and they're here. And that's enough for me. I know it's hard to understand, especially when you're used to living in a world where success is everything. But for me, peace isn't found in trying to get back what I've lost. It's found in appreciating what I have now, in this moment." He had expected Thomas to jump at the chance to regain his former life, but instead, he was met with a man who had found a different kind of richness, one that didn't rely on fame or fortune, but on the simple, enduring joys of life. Thomas leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving William's. "I'm grateful for your offer, truly. But I've learned that peace and happiness aren't always where we expect to find them. They're in the simple things, the things we often overlook. That's the life I've chosen, and it's brought me a kind of contentment that I never thought possible." William sat there, absorbing the quiet wisdom in Thomas's words, realizing that the lesson he was receiving was far more valuable than anything he could have anticipated. As Thomas's words settled in the room, William felt a profound shift within himself. It was as if a veil had been lifted, allowing him to see his life with a clarity he had never experienced before. The man sitting across from him, with his simple wisdom and quiet contentment, had just unraveled the tightly wound fabric of William's existence, exposing the threads that had been fraying for years. William had always measured his worth by his achievements, the deals he closed, the wealth he accumulated, the status he maintained. His life had been a relentless pursuit of success, each victory followed by the urgent need to chase the next. There had been little time for reflection, little space for anything that didn't contribute to his ascent up the ladder of success. Family gatherings, personal hobbies, even moments of rest were often sacrificed at the altar of ambition. But now, in this small, modest room, listening to Thomas speak of finding peace in life's simplest pleasures, William was confronted with the emptiness that often lurked behind his professional triumphs. He realized that he had been running, always running, from one goal to the next, without ever truly stopping to consider what he was running toward. The recognition hit him hard, like a wave crashing against the shore, reshaping the landscape of his thoughts. William's mind drifted back to memories he had long buried, times when he had chosen work over family, when he had been too busy to notice the little joys of life. He thought of the people he had pushed away in his quest for success, the moments he had missed with his children, the times he had been physically present but emotionally absent. These were the costs of his ambition, and now, sitting here with Thomas, they felt unbearably heavy. The concept of balance, something he had always dismissed as an excuse for those who couldn't keep up, now seemed vital, even necessary. William realized that he had been living an unbalanced life, one that had skewed too far in one direction, leaving him empty in other aspects that truly mattered. He had amassed wealth and power, but at what expense? What had he sacrificed in the process? As these thoughts churned within him, William began to see the truth in Thomas's words. Happiness, real happiness, wasn't about the number of zeros in his bank account or the size of his office. It was about the connections he made, the moments of genuine human interaction, the small joys that filled everyday life. It was about finding peace in simplicity, in the things that couldn't be bought or measured. For the first time in years, William allowed himself to sit in this realization, to truly absorb it without rushing to the next task. He didn't know exactly what this newfound understanding would lead to, but he knew that something had changed within him. The drive that had once pushed him relentlessly forward now felt tempered by a deeper awareness, one that valued balance over sheer accumulation. In this quiet moment, William felt a sense of liberation, as if a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. The world hadn't changed. His responsibilities, his business, his life would still be there when he left this room. But he had. And that transformation, that shift in perspective, was something he knew would stay with him, guiding him in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The silence between the two men was no longer filled with the weight of unspoken words, but with a shared understanding. Thomas had given William something more valuable than any business deal. He had given him a glimpse of what life could be when it was lived with balance, with purpose, and with a focus on the things that truly mattered. William left Thomas's modest apartment with a heart full of introspection. The drive back to his penthouse was unusually quiet, the city's usual chaos muted by the thoughts swirling in his mind. He felt as though he was seeing the world through new eyes, the weight of his earlier realizations still pressing down on him, but with a sense of clarity that he hadn't felt in years. The first thing William did when he got home was to take a long, hard look at his life. The opulent surroundings, the lavish lifestyle, it all seemed a little hollow now. He thought about the people who had always been there, waiting on the fringes of his life, hoping for his attention. His wife, his children, old friends he hadn't spoken to in years. He had been so caught up in his pursuit of success that he had let these relationships wither, thinking there would always be time later. But after his encounter with Thomas, William knew that later wasn't guaranteed. The fleeting nature of life, the fragility of everything he had taken for granted, it all became painfully clear. And so, he decided that it was time to make a change, not just in his business, but in his personal life as well. The next day, William began reaching out, starting with his family. It wasn't easy. There was a lot of ground to cover, a lot of distance that had grown between them over the years. He called his wife first, asking her to meet him for lunch, something they hadn't done in a long time. She was surprised but agreed, and over a quiet meal, William found himself talking to her in a way he hadn't in years. He listened, truly listened, to what she had to say about her life, her feelings, the things she had kept to herself because he had always been too busy to hear them. From there, William reached out to his children. His son, who was away at college, was the first to receive his call. Their conversation was tentative at first, but as William persisted, asking about his son's life, his studies, his hopes for the future, the walls that had built up between them started to crumble. William could hear the surprise in his son's voice, but also a warmth that hadn't been there before. It was a beginning, small, but significant. His daughter, who was still in high school, was next. William realized how much he had missed, her school events, her friends, the small but important milestones in her life. He made a promise to her that he would be more present, more involved, and for the first time he could see how much that meant to her. It wasn't just his family that William reconnected with. He reached out to old friends, people he had once been close to, but had drifted away from as his career consumed more and more of his time. Some were surprised to hear from him, others wary, but William persisted. He apologized where apologies were due, and slowly he began to rebuild those friendships, not based on what they could do for him, but on a genuine desire to rekindle the bonds they once shared. Each reconnection was a small victory, a step toward rebuilding a life that had been neglected for too long. William found that these conversations, these moments of genuine connection, brought him a sense of fulfillment that his business deals never had. It was as though he was rediscovering a part of himself that had been buried under the weight of his ambitions. As days turned into weeks, William noticed changes in his relationships. His wife began to open up to him more, their conversations deeper and more meaningful than they had been in years. His children started to reach out to him on their own, sharing parts of their lives that he had never been a part of before. Old friends began to call him, not out of obligation or politeness, but because they wanted to reconnect, to rebuild what had been lost. For the first time in a long time, William felt a sense of balance, a peace that came not from closing deals or acquiring wealth, but from the simple act of being present in the lives of those he cared about. The transformation wasn't immediate, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was real, and it was something William knew he would continue to nurture. In these quiet moments of reconnection, William found something he hadn't known he was searching for, a deeper, more meaningful way of living. He began to understand that success wasn't just about what he achieved in the boardroom, but about the relationships he built, the lives he touched, and the legacy he would leave behind. As the weeks turned into months, the changes in William's life began to take root, transforming not just his relationships, but his entire perspective on what it meant to live a meaningful life. The conversations with Thomas had sparked something deep within him, a desire to not only reconnect with his loved ones, but also to give back to the community in a way that aligned with the new values he was cultivating. William began spending more time walking through the neighborhoods of the city that he had once only driven past in his limousine. He saw the world through a different lens now, one that was more attuned to the struggles and the beauty that existed in the places where people lived on the margins. The street musicians, the artists who painted on corners, the small, vibrant communities that thrived despite the hardships, they all began to capture his attention and his heart. He thought often of Thomas, who had found peace in the simplicity of life, and who had reminded him of the importance of creativity, art, and human connection. Inspired by this, William made a decision that would have once seemed unthinkable. He began to invest not just in businesses, but in people, in the artists and communities that had so much to offer, but lacked the resources to flourish. William started by creating a foundation dedicated to supporting street artists and musicians. He saw the talent that existed in the streets of New York, in the parks, in the subways, and he wanted to give these artists a platform. The foundation provided grants, opportunities to perform in larger venues, and resources to help them develop their craft. It wasn't just about charity, it was about recognizing the value these artists brought to the city and giving them the recognition and support they deserved. But William didn't stop there. He also began investing in the communities themselves, funding after-school programs, supporting local businesses, and creating spaces where people could come together to share their talents and their stories. He understood now that wealth wasn't just something to be accumulated, it was something to be shared, something that could be used to uplift others and to build a better world. Throughout this process, William stayed in touch with Thomas, visiting him regularly. Their friendship deepened, rooted in mutual respect and a shared understanding of what truly mattered in life. One day, during one of these visits, William noticed the old piano that had been sitting in the corner of Thomas's apartment, untouched for years. "Thomas," William said, his voice gentle but encouraging, "have you thought about playing again? Not in the concert halls, but here for yourself, or maybe in the parks. It can be something new, something that brings you joy, even if it's just for you." The music was different now, more reflective, perhaps a bit quieter, but it was still beautiful, still filled with the same passion that had once captivated audiences. Eventually, Thomas began to take his music out into the world again. Not in the grand concert halls, but in the parks, where he would sit at public pianos or bring a small keyboard and play for anyone who happened to be passing by. The people who stopped to listen didn't know who he was or the life he had once led. They simply knew that the music was moving, that it touched something inside them. William often joined Thomas during these impromptu concerts, standing off to the side, watching as people gathered, drawn by the music. He saw the smiles on their faces, the way they paused in their busy lives to enjoy something simple and beautiful. It was in these moments that William felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had played a part in bringing this music back into the world. The transformation in William's life was profound, but it wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping changes. It was about the quiet, steady shift in his priorities, the way he had learned to value people over profits, connection over competition. He had found a new purpose, one that brought together his business acumen with his newfound understanding of what it meant to live a good life. As William and Thomas sat together in the park, watching the sunset, while the last notes of a melody lingered in the air, William felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace, of contentment, of knowing that he was exactly where he was meant to be, and for that, he was deeply, profoundly grateful.